The morning the bulls arrived was a Tuesday in early April, 1993. I remember the air had that particular cold, damp weight to it that promises a late frost, the kind of morning where the fog hangs low in the hollows and doesn't burn off until 10, the sky the color of old tin. The truck that brought them was a tired-looking single-axle gooseneck, rust blooming around the wheel wells, and the man driving it looked about as tired as his equipment. He'd come all the way from a dispersal sale 3 counties over, and he was anxious to get his check and be on his way. There were 28 of them in the trailer, mostly mixed-breed yearlings, none of them much to look at. They were rangy and lean, carrying more bone than beef, their winter coats still shaggy and dull. They averaged, maybe, 800 pounds apiece, and I'd paid 42 cents a pound for them on the hoof, which was about 10 cents less than anyone was paying for anything they planned to keep. They were, to put it plainly, a sorry-looking lot. As the last one trotted down the ramp, a black-hided bull with one droopy ear, my neighbor pulled up in his truck. His was a new Ford, always clean, the kind of truck a man buys when he's more concerned with what the banker thinks than with what the ground needs. He idled there at the fence line, the diesel making a low, even hum, and rolled down his passenger side window. He didn't get out. He just leaned over the seat, his elbow resting on the door, and watched the last of my pitiful herd trot into the holding pen. He took a slow sip of coffee from a thermos cup, the kind with a dealership logo on it. He looked at the bulls, then at me, then back at the bulls. He had that look of polite concern that men in our parts use when they think you've finally lost your mind but are too neighborly to say it outright. "That's a rough-looking string of bulls," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I just nodded, leaning on a steel post. "They'll do," I said. He took another sip of coffee. "What are you planning on doing with 28 feeder bulls on that scrub patch?" he asked, gesturing with his head toward the 63 acres of thorn and Osage orange that climbed the north slope behind my barn. It was a piece of ground nobody had ever done anything with. It was too steep and rocky for a plow, too thick with brush for pasture. My father had called it the 60-acre problem. His father had probably called it the same. My neighbor had his own opinion. He'd cleared a similar patch on his place a few years back. "I can get a man with a D6 dozer in here for $300 an hour, he said. He'd have that whole mess pushed into a pile and burned in a week. Another $2,000 for chemical spray to keep it from coming back. You'd have pasture by next summer." I knew the numbers. I'd run them myself a dozen times. It was the modern way, the fast way. The expensive way. It was the way that made sense if you believed the only tool for any job was overwhelming force. I looked at the bulls, now milling around the water trough, and then back at him. "I told him I was clearing it," I said. "Just that." He shook his head slowly, a little smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a mean smile. It was the smile of a man who is absolutely certain about the way the world works, and is watching someone else learn a hard lesson. "Well," he said, putting the truck in gear. "You've always had more patience than sense." He rolled up his window and drove on down the county road, leaving me there with the quiet sounds of the bulls settling in and the damp chill of the morning. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was buying sick animals, I was broke, I was trying some new government program that paid you to let your land go wild. The story didn't bother me. I'd been the subject of diner talk before. What bothered me was that nagging sliver of doubt, the one that tells you maybe they're right. Maybe this was a fool's errand. I didn't tell him what I was really looking for. I wasn't even sure myself, not completely. But I had a reason, and the reason was in a cardboard box on a shelf in the barn, tucked away behind a stack of old seed catalogs. I hadn't looked at it in years. I had put it away because I wasn't ready for what it was asking me to do. But with 28 hungry bulls standing in my pen, I figured I was ready now. I didn't yet understand what the bulls already knew in their bones, what the ground itself had been waiting for. I only knew that my father had left me a question, and I was tired of not knowing the answer. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just sentiment. I'm a practical man. I have to be. This farm has been in my family for 4 generations, and it hasn't survived on wishes. It survived on hard work, careful accounting, and a deep-seated reluctance to spend a dollar when a dime and some sweat would do the job. The neighbor's way, the dozer and the chemical way, would have cost me close to $10,000 when all was said and done. $10,000 I didn't have to spend on a piece of ground that might never pay it back. My father had an aphorism for that. He had an aphorism for everything. You can't farm what you've already spent, he'd say, usually while sharpening a shovel or mending a piece of harness. The bank owns the crop before it's even in the ground. The 28 bulls, on the other hand, had cost me just under $9,500. But they were an asset. Come fall, after a summer of work, they'd be heavier. I figured I could put another 200 pounds on each of them. Even if the market stayed flat, I'd get my money back, maybe a little more. The work they did in the meantime would be free. That was the simple arithmetic of it. But the real reason went deeper than that. It went back to a conversation I'd had with my father when I was a boy, maybe 14 years old. We were standing at the same fence line, looking up at that same 63 acres of scrub. It was late summer, and the locusts were buzzing so loud it felt like the heat itself was making a sound. I asked him why we didn't clear it. Some ground you can't push, he'd said, his eyes narrowed, studying the slope. This piece, it's all rock and clay under that brush. You bring a dozer in here, you'll scrape off what little topsoil there is and you'll be left with a running sore every time it rains. It'll bleed mud for 20 years, he pointed with his chin at the dense thickets of multiflora rose and honey locust. That stuff has roots that go down 10 feet. You can't kill it with force. You got to worry it. You got to apply steady pressure, day after day, until it gives up. I didn't understand what he meant then. To a 14-year-old boy, the only answer to a problem like that was a bigger machine. But the words stuck with me. Later, after he was gone, I found the box. It was an old apple crate, dusty and dry, pushed way back on a high shelf in the quietest corner of the barn. Inside were his things, a few worn-out leather gloves, a broken pocket knife, some receipts from the 50s, and 3 marbled composition notebooks. They were his farm ledgers, filled with his careful, slanted handwriting. For years, I just kept the box there. It felt like a monument, something too private to disturb. But one winter night, a few years before the bulls arrived, the quiet of the house got to be too much and I brought the box inside. I sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb and opened the notebooks. Most of the entries were what you'd expect. Page after page of numbers and notes. April 12, 1958. Planted 40 acres of corn. Soil dry. Sky clear, July 2, 1961. 15 inches of rain. Came too fast. Some washing on the east field, October 20, 1965. Finished harvest. 90 bushels to the acre. Price at the co-op is $1.10. Not enough, it was the simple, unadorned record of a man's life, measured in rainfall and bushels and the slow, grinding turn of the seasons. It was hypnotic. I read for hours. Then, in the second book, I found the page. It was dated May, 1968. The top of the page was about the cost of diesel fuel and a note about a sick cow. But at the bottom, he had drawn a rough map of the farm. It was surprisingly accurate, all the fields and creeks laid out in their proper places. And there, on the north slope, across the 63 acres of scrub, he had drawn a faint, dotted line. It wasn't straight, but it had a purpose to it. It curved with the contour of the land, finding the path of least resistance. It connected our back pasture with the old county road on the other side of the ridge. And next to this dotted line, in the margin, he had written just 5 words. The first 4 were underlined. Old trace? Bulls only, and then, after a space, two more words that changed everything. Never dug. I stared at that page for a long time. An old trace. A cattle trail, maybe. A road from a time before fences and property lines. He had seen something, some hint of it in the landscape. A depression, a line of rocks, a change in the vegetation. He had a theory. But he'd never been able to prove it. Bulls only, he'd written. Not a dozer. Not chemicals. Bulls. He believed they were the only tool for the job. Why? Because they wouldn't scrape the land bare. They would follow the path that was already there. They would worry the brush away, not tear it away. They would feel the compacted earth of the old roadbed under their hooves and they would naturally follow it. It was a theory born of a lifetime of observation, of paying attention so closely that the land itself began to speak to you. He had left the question hanging there on the page, a piece of unfinished business. And that night, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, I knew that one day I would have to try and answer it for him. The first order of business was fencing. That 63-acre patch had never been properly fenced, only a few strands of rusty barbed wire on rotting locust posts marking the boundary. It wasn't near enough to hold 28 determined bulls. I spent the better part of 2 weeks on that job. The work was slow and hard. The ground was, as my father had said, mostly rock and clay. Digging post holes was a constant battle. I'd start with the tractor-mounted auger, and it would grind and screech for a foot, maybe 2, before hitting a shelf of limestone. Then it was out with the digging bar, the clamshells, and my own sweat. I'd pry and chip and scoop, an inch at a time, until I had a hole deep enough to set a post in concrete. I set 112 8-inch wood posts that way, one every 20 feet. My hands were raw, my back was a constant, dull ache. Every evening I'd come in long after dark, covered in mud and stone dust, and fall into a chair too tired to eat. My neighbor would drive by in the mornings on his way to town, and I'd see him slow down, watching me wrestle with another rock. He never stopped, but I could feel his certainty radiating from the clean cab of his truck. He was watching a man make a fool of himself in slow motion. But as I worked, I was also watching. I was walking every foot of that ground, learning its contours, its soft spots and its hard places. I started to see what my father might have seen. There was a subtle depression, maybe 20 feet wide, that ran diagonally up the slope. It was almost impossible to see from a distance, but when you were standing in it, you could feel it. The ground was different under your boots. Firmer. Less cluttered with the loose rock that littered the rest of the hillside. The trees grew differently along its edges, as if their roots had hit the compacted boundary of an old roadbed. It was just a hint, a ghost of a path, but it was there. And it followed the dotted line on my father's map almost exactly. Once the fence was up, 5 strands of high-tensile wire, tight as a guitar string, I opened the gate. The bulls had been in the holding pen for 2 weeks on a steady diet of hay and water. They were restless. They filed out, cautiously at first, then with more confidence, their heads up, sniffing the air. They spread out across the lower edge of the scrub, and for the first day, they didn't do much of anything but graze on the sparse spring grass along the fence line. I started to feel that doubt creep in again. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they'd just hug the fence and leave the real brush untouched. But on the second morning, something had changed. A few of the bolder ones had started to push into the edges of the multiflora rose thickets. They weren't eating the thorny canes. They were nibbling at the new, tender shoots at the base. They were using their weight and the thick bosses of their heads to push into the thickets, creating small clearings where they could stand and browse. They were patient. Methodical. They weren't trying to conquer the brush. They were just looking for breakfast. My father's words came back to me. You got to worry it, that's what they were doing. They were applying a small, steady pressure. They weren't fighting the thorns, they were finding a way around them, a way through them. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. They worked as a loose herd, moving slowly up the slope. They'd clear a small area, browsing it down to the dirt, and then move on. They were creating a network of small trails, like deer paths, that wound through the densest parts of the scrub. I supplemented their feed, of course. Every other day I'd haul a round bale of hay up to a feeder I'd placed in the middle of the patch, and I kept the mineral lick full. They needed more than just thorn bushes to put on weight. But the brush was becoming a significant part of their diet. They were stripping the leaves off the locust saplings, girdling the young Osage orange trees by rubbing their horns on the bark, and trampling the rose canes until they broke and died. I could have gone in there myself with a chainsaw and a brush axe. I thought about it more than once. It was tempting to try and speed things up, to force the issue. But the notebook's instruction was clear. Bulls only. My father had his reasons. I had to trust that he knew something I didn't. He knew that a man with a chainsaw would just cut a straight line, following his own idea of where the path should be. But the bulls, they would follow the path of least resistance. They would feel the firmer ground of the old trace under their hooves. They would be drawn to it without even knowing why. And so I waited. I watched. I hauled hay and fixed the fence where a falling limb had loosened a wire. And I let the bulls do their slow, quiet work. The summer of '93 was hot and dry. The pastures in the valley turned brown and brittle by August, and the creek slowed to a trickle. But up on that north slope, in the scrub, things were different. The deep-rooted brush stayed green longer, and the bulls kept working. The change was no longer imperceptible. From the county road, you could see a definite thinning, a wide corridor of lighter green cutting diagonally across the hillside. It wasn't a clean line, not like a bulldozer would make. It was a feathered, organic opening, wider in some places, narrower in others, following the path the bulls had chosen. They had worried it. They had pushed and trampled and browsed and rubbed for 4 months, and the 60-acre problem was starting to look less like a problem. It was starting to look like a plan. The neighbor didn't say anything. He'd still slow down when he drove past, but his look had changed. The polite certainty was gone, replaced by a kind of grudging curiosity. He was a cattleman, and he could see that the bulls were gaining weight. They were filling out, their ribs disappearing under a layer of fat, their coats shiny and healthy. Whatever they were finding to eat up there, it was agreeing with them. My own investigation was becoming more focused. I started walking the paths they had made every evening, after the heat of the day had broken. I carried a 4-foot soil probe, a simple T-handled steel rod that let you feel the composition of the ground without digging. In most places on the slope, the probe would sink in 6 or 8 inches, through the thin layer of topsoil, and then hit the sticky, dense clay underneath. But inside the main corridor the bulls had cleared, it was different. I'd push the probe down, and it would go through the topsoil, but then it would hit something hard. Not the dull thud of clay, but a sharp, gritty stop. It felt like compacted gravel. It felt like a roadbed. I started probing in a grid pattern, every 10 feet, marking the spots where I hit that hard layer with a small piece of flagging tape. Over the course of a month, a picture began to emerge. The flagged spots formed a clear path, about 20 feet wide, running right up the center of the bull's corridor. It matched the depression I had felt while digging the fence posts. It matched the dotted line on my father's map. The evidence was building, layer by layer. One evening, I was probing near the top of the ridge and the probe hit something with a loud clink, not like rock, but like metal. I got a shovel from the truck and started digging carefully. About a foot down, I uncovered it. It was an old ox shoe, much larger and heavier than a horseshoe, the kind they used for draft animals in the 19th century. It was pitted with rust but still whole. I stood there holding it in my hand, the red dust of the clay clinging to it. It was the first solid piece of proof, a tangible link to the past my father had only suspected. It was one thing to have a theory, to read a note in a book. It was another thing entirely to hold a piece of that theory in your hand. That night, I didn't sleep much. I took the ox shoe and the notebook to the barn and sat there for a long time, the single bulb overhead casting long shadows. I laid the shoe on the open page next to my father's map. Never dug, he had written. He had seen the signs, walked the same ground, felt the same firm earth under his boots. He might have even used a probe himself. But he never took that final step. Maybe he didn't have the time. Maybe he didn't have the right animals. Or maybe he just thought it was better to leave some questions for the next man to answer. I began to understand the genius of his instruction. Bulls only, a bulldozer would have scraped the ox shoe away without a thought, burying it in a pile of debris. A man with a shovel would have found it eventually, but he would have been digging blind, wasting time and energy. The bulls, however, had done the work for me. They had cleared the brush, exposed the surface, and led me right to it. They had an instinct for the path, a kind of topographic sense that a machine lacks. They didn't just clear the land, they read it. As winter approached, the first hard frosts killed off the last of the green vegetation. The leaves fell from the locust and the osage orange, and for the first time, the entire trace was visible, a pale gray-brown ribbon running through the darker scrub. The bulls' work was largely done. They had opened the way. Now it was my turn to understand what it meant. By the following May, the transformation was undeniable. The spring rains had settled the soil trampled by the bulls, and a surprising carpet of native grasses was starting to sprout along the cleared trace. The multiflora rose was trying to come back, of course, but without the dense canopy of the scrub to protect it, it was weak and straggly. A little bit of spot mowing would keep it in check now. The 60-acre problem was no longer a problem. It was turning into a silvopasture, a mix of trees and grass that provided both forage and shade. But the real prize was the trace itself. It was a solid, all-weather roadbed, something generations of rain and compaction had made harder than any farm lane I could ever build myself. I knew I needed another set of eyes on it. Not a skeptic this time, but someone who knew how to read the history of a piece of ground. I called a man named Miller, who had been the county road engineer for 40 years before he retired. He was in his late 70s, a quiet, deliberate man who had forgotten more about drainage, soil compaction, and right-of-ways than most people ever learn. I didn't tell him about my father's notebook or the ox shoe. I just told him I had something interesting on my north slope and asked if he'd come take a look. He showed up a few days later in an old pickup, the bed filled with surveying stakes and dusty tools. I met him at the gate, and we walked. He didn't say much at first, just looked, his eyes taking in the contour of the hill, the way the new grass was growing, the line of old, gnarled oaks that bordered the trace on its upper side. He walked with a slight stoop, his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally stopping to kick at a stone with the toe of his worn leather boot. I pointed out the 20-foot wide corridor, the uniform grade, the way it seemed to be slightly crowned in the middle. He just nodded, his face giving nothing away. We got to the spot where I'd found the ox shoe. I showed him the place where the soil probe had hit the compacted gravel layer. He grunted, took a jackknife from his pocket, and knelt down. He was surprisingly nimble for a man his age. He scraped away the topsoil with the blade of his knife, exposing the layer beneath. It was a mix of creek gravel and crushed limestone, packed so tight it was almost like concrete. He picked up a piece and rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture. Then he went quiet. It was a profound silence. He stood up, slowly, and looked back down the way we had come, and then up toward the ridge. He was looking at the whole thing, seeing it not as a path through the brush, but as a piece of engineering. He was calculating the grade, the drainage, the logic of its placement on the hillside. He stood there for a full minute, silent and still. The only sound was the wind in the new leaves of the oaks. I waited. I knew better than to interrupt a man who was thinking. Finally, He closed his knife with a soft click, wiped the blade on his trousers, and put it back in his pocket. He turned to me. "That's a roadbed," he said. It wasn't a question or a guess. It was a professional conclusion. "That's a drover's road. Pre-Civil War, I'd wager. See how it follows the military crest of the hill? Stays off the skyline where you could be seen, but high enough to stay out of the mud in the bottom. Perfect grade." They didn't have modern survey equipment, but they knew how to read the land. They knew how to move cattle. He pointed down the slope. This would have connected the old valley farms to the main stock route that ran along the top of that ridge. They would have driven thousands of head of cattle and hogs up this trace on their way to the river markets. He looked at the bulls, grazing peacefully on the new grass. "You didn't clear this with a machine," he said, another statement of fact. "No," I said. "The bulls did it." He nodded slowly, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "Well," he said, after another long pause. "I've been looking at land in this county for 50 years. I've seen dozer work, I've seen chemical work. I've never seen anything like this. You haven't just cleared a patch of ground. You've uncovered a piece of history. It's substantial." That was the word I had been waiting for. Substantial. It was quiet validation, delivered without fanfare, but it landed with the weight of a bedrock truth. My father had been right. His theory, sketched out on a page in a cheap notebook, was real. The land had held its secret for over 100 years, waiting for the right kind of pressure, the right kind of attention, to reveal it. The true value of the trace became clear in the weeks that followed. That old roadbed didn't just give me a path through the brush, it fundamentally changed the way my farm worked. For as long as I could remember, getting cattle from my main pastures to the back side of the farm had been a major undertaking. It involved a 2-mile trip by truck and trailer down our farm lane, out onto the county road, and then up a steep, winding access road on the other side. It was a half-day's work for 2 men, stressful for the animals and for me. The trace changed all that. It connected my barn lot directly to that back pasture. What used to take 2 miles and a trailer now took a 1/4-mile walk. I could move cattle from one side of the farm to the other in 15 minutes, by myself, with a good dog. The economic impact was immediate and significant. I calculated I'd save nearly $1,000 a year in fuel and labor just from not having to trailer those animals back and forth. But the biggest discovery was yet to come. The trace, as it neared the top of the ridge, dipped down into a small, secluded hollow I had never been able to get to before. It was choked with the same thorn and scrub as the rest of the slope. The bulls, following the trace, had pushed their way in. And there, at the bottom of the hollow, they had found it. A spring. It wasn't a big one, but it was steady, bubbling up out of a limestone ledge, clear and cold. It ran year-round, forming a small, clean pool before disappearing back into the ground. It was a source of water I never knew I had. Access to water is everything in the cattle business. That spring meant I could now run 50 head of cattle on the back side of the farm, where before I could only run 20, and even then I had to haul water to them in dry years. That one discovery, that small, hidden spring, effectively increased the carrying capacity of my farm by nearly 1/3. The numbers were stark. The dozer and the chemicals would have cost me $10,000 and likely would have destroyed the subtle evidence of the trace, burying the spring under a mountain of pushed brush. My investment was different. The bulls had cost $9,500. By the fall, they had gained, on average, 250 pounds each. The market had firmed up, and I sold them for 72 cents a pound. After accounting for the cost of hay and minerals, I cleared over $8,000 on the animals themselves. The clearing, the road, the spring, all of it was free. Better than free. The land had paid me to heal it. One afternoon in late September, just before I shipped the bulls, my neighbor drove up the lane. This time he didn't stop at the fence line. He pulled all the way up to the barn and got out. We stood there for a minute, not saying much, watching the heavy-set bulls graze on the hillside. The trace was clear as day now, a gentle, curving road leading up into the trees. You could see the path they had made to the spring. "I hear you found water up there," he said. "A little," I said. He nodded, chewing on a piece of hay he'd picked. He looked at the bulls. He looked at the trace. He was a good cattleman, and he understood exactly what he was seeing. He knew what that road and that water were worth. He stood there for what felt like a long time. I could see the gears turning in his head, rerunning the calculations, weighing his own certainty against the evidence in front of him. Finally, he sighed, a short puff of air. "That's not as thick as it was," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the hill. He kicked at the gravel of the driveway. Then he looked me square in the eye. "You know," he said, a faint, wry smile on his face. "You always did have more patience than sense. Turns out, maybe they're the same thing." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once, got back in his clean truck, and drove away. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a surrender. It was better than that. It was a quiet concession from one farmer to another. It was an acknowledgement that there was more than one way to solve a problem, and that the fastest, most expensive way wasn't always the best. It was, in its own understated way, the most complete vindication I could have asked for. That evening, I walked up the trace myself, all the way to the spring. I stood there and listened to the quiet sounds of the evening, the cricket starting up, the low murmur of the bulls grazing below. I thought about my father, and the gift he had left me, hidden in the pages of a notebook. It wasn't a treasure map. It was a map of a different kind. It was a map about how to pay attention. I stood on that old cattle trace as the sun went down, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple over the western ridge. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of cut hay and damp earth. Below me, the 28 bulls grazed quietly, their dark shapes moving slowly through the dusk. They had done their work. In a few days, they would be gone, on their way to another farm, another life. They would never know the history they had uncovered or the problem they had solved. They had just followed their instincts, looking for food and the path of least resistance, and in doing so, they had revealed a truth that had been hidden for a century. My father used to say the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. That 63-acre patch of scrub had been a problem for my grandfather, and for my father, and for me. It was a problem on the tax bill, a problem to look at every morning, a problem of wasted land. We had all looked at it, but we had looked at it with the wrong eyes. We saw an obstacle to be overcome, a fortress to be assaulted with force and steel. We saw the brush. My father, in his later years, began to see something else. He saw the land underneath the brush. He learned to listen to it, to read its subtle language. He left me not an answer, but a better question. He taught me that some work doesn't require a bigger engine, it requires a deeper patience. The modern way is to apply force. To overwhelm. To get the job done quickly, to measure success in hours and dollars per acre. There is a place for that. Some ground needs to be pushed. But there is other ground, older ground, that will not be pushed. It has to be persuaded. It has to be worried. You have to be willing to move slow, to let the seasons and the animals do their work, to trust a process you cannot completely control. The bulls weren't pitiful. They were the perfect tool for the job, a tool that was alive, that could think and feel and adapt. A bulldozer has no opinion. It imposes the operator's will on the land, flattening its character, erasing its history. But a living animal works with the land. The bulls felt the firm, compacted earth of the trace under their hooves, and it felt good to them. It was easier walking. So they followed it. They didn't need a map. Their bodies knew the way. That is a kind of wisdom we are in danger of forgetting. The wisdom of instinct, of patience, of steady pressure applied over time. It's the wisdom that built this country, that laid these old roads, that knew how to work with the wildness of a place instead of just trying to pave it over. The notebook still sits on the shelf in the barn, but it's not in the box anymore. I keep it out where I can see it. It reminds me that the most valuable things we inherit aren't always the things we can see. Sometimes it's a piece of advice, a half-finished thought, a question scrawled in the margin of a page. It's a legacy of curiosity. A reminder to look deeper, to listen harder, and to trust the slow, quiet work of the world. My father never got to see this trace cleared. He never got to water his cattle at that hidden spring. But he's here. He's in the curve of the road, in the firmness of the soil, in the simple, profound rightness of a theory proven true across the decades. Some ground you can't push. You got to worry it. He was right about that. And he was right that sometimes, the best tool for the job is the one that knows how to wait. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, a patch of land that everybody's given up on, or maybe an old notebook with a question you haven't answered yet, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe if this meant something to you.